Hello, and welcome to Inquisitor, the show where we explore everything that's curious, non-fiction topics such as history, crime, music, and culture. I'm your host, Chris Cella. My guest today is author and historian Gary Roberts. Gary has written numerous books on violence in the American Southwest, including Doc Holliday, The Life and Legend, and Death Comes for the Chief Justice, the Slaw-Reinerson Quarrel. How did you become fascinated with the American Southwest, and particularly the violence in American Southwest?
Well, I guess it probably goes back to the fact that I grew up playing cowboys and Indians. Somewhere along the way, when I was still very young, I got interested in the violent side of it because that's what the old Western movies were. So I got interested in people like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and Billy the Kid and all that. And as time went on, I began to ask myself, what caused this?
Today we discuss a topic Gary has investigated for over 50 years, the Sand Creek Massacre. Though this bloody event took place 150 years ago, its effects are still strongly felt amongst the two Indian tribes affected, the Cheyenne and Arapaho. The Sand Creek Massacre is one of the bloodiest and most shameful events in the history of the United States. It all started in 1859, when roughly 100,000 settlers left their homes in places like Virginia or newly formed Wisconsin for Pikes Peak, the site of fresh opportunity. Many left their jobs and families for the excitement of being a gold prospector on the frontier. On the way to Pikes Peak, the European Americans encountered numerous tribes such as the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Iroquois.
By the time of the Colorado Gold Rush, you have to realize that there's close to 240 years of history between Indians and whites. And whites had operated almost from the beginning with the idea that they had the right of conquest.
Many are familiar with the term manifest destiny, but in 19th century America, it was simply a new term to describe an old concept. The idea of one people dominating another, not simply because it can, but because it should, due to reasons of perceived superiority.
You can go back centuries. There's always an outsider group, whether you're talking about the Persians or whether you're talking about the Vikings or what I call a significant other. And the characteristic of that other is that is a savage. Over time it develops. It's not initially so much racial as it is this idea of the savage. They don't deal with Creeks and Cherokees and Iroquois as separate groups with different values and different ideas and different religions and different systems of government. It's just the term Indian that applies, and they assume that they're all alike, that they're all backward, that they don't have a real political system, and they don't have any of the things that are characteristic of, quote, civilized people. So by the time that the settlers get to Colorado, nobody's really interested in finding out what the values of the Cheyennes are. Suddenly, 100,000 people rushed into Colorado, and they're occupying lands that were recognized by treaty as belonging to the Cheyennes and Arapahoes.
Treaties between whites and Indians were common on the frontier. In exchange for land, the government would grant Indians trade goods, money, and the assurance that part of the land would be reserved for the tribe itself. Being that there were literally hundreds of treaties, it's clear that at one point or another, each were dissolved, some before they were even to take effect. Even if a treaty was reached, the chiefs who signed the treaties often did not speak for the tribe as a whole, and therefore seceded land that they did not actively control.
In a very, very short period of time, the environment changed. As time went on, more and more of the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes were more and more suspicious of the whites, particularly after it became clear that they were not negotiating in good faith. Land ownership was not the key factor because they didn't understand the idea of owning a piece of ground the way that you and I would understand it. They wanted the right to travel over it and to move over across these lands in order to use the resources.
Arguably, the most valuable resource for Cheyenne culture was the buffalo. It provided a source of food, clothing, and shelter. With the massive influx of white settlers, the herds dwindled, and animosity grew palpable. The white settlers also began to feel especially more uneasy with the native cultures.
See, what had happened was that in the spring, there were some incidents There was a murder of a family relatively close to Denver, but when the Indian War of 1864 really began, most of it was in western Kansas and western Nebraska. What Colorado felt more than anything else was the supply sources were cut off, so that they weren't getting mail, they weren't getting shipments of goods. It caused panic in the town. Rumors were flying everywhere. But eventually what happened was the governor kept pushing it to the point that he wanted a special regiment for the purpose of fighting Indians. He had issued a proclamation authorizing citizens to pursue and kill hostile Indians.
At this time, we introduced the provocateur.
Colonel John Milton Chivington. Chivington was a Methodist preacher before the war. He was a very impressive man. He stood about 6 feet 4 inches tall. He weighed about 260 pounds. When the war came, he decided that he wanted to be a soldier, not a preacher. And so he became the major of the 1st Colorado Regiment. He was already a controversial figure. Now, he was a very ambitious man. He wanted to go to Congress. He pushed very hard for promotions. After the Battle of Glorieta, he expected to be promoted to Brigadier General. And when that did not happen, he grew more and more aggressive in trying to get the attention of his superiors. He needs a quick victory. He doesn't have time for an extended campaign. He needs something that's quick and sure. And the only sure thing in Colorado are the Indians at Sand Creek.
The Indians at Sand Creek were made up of 2 tribes, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. The 2 tribes believed themselves to be protected by the Treaty of Fort Wise. The treaty limited their land ownership to 1/13 the size of what was already a limited area due to an earlier treaty. In exchange for their signature, they were promised safety by the U.S. military. In addition to buffalo skins, the Indians now displayed the American flag. This, they believed, would signal to any gun-toting whites that they were friendly and meant no harm, but this would not stand. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led his militia of 700 men into Sand Creek and ordered an attack. As the troops marched on the camp, the peace-loving chief, Black Kettle, did not immediately see the troops as a threat.
When Black Kettle saw that it was troops, his initial reaction was, "Don't worry about it, we're under the protection of the flag." So he had an American flag over his teepee with a white flag underneath. And so he suggested to his people, "Don't run, we'll be okay."
But then the troops opened fire, and panic ensued. One militiaman was quoted as saying,
"We burst on the camp like so many wild fellows." It's not like it was a well-organized attack. They were just going wherever they could find somebody to shoot at. By this time, there were lots of people already running up the creek bed. The attack was brutal. The slaughter of close to 200 Indians, 2/3 of them were women and children. The bodies were scalped and mutilated. One of the chiefs, White Antelope, walked out into the creek bed, and he stood there and folded his arms and began to sing his death song, "Only the Mountains Live Forever." He was shot down in the creek bed. A considerable portion of those fighting, if you can call it fighting, were just people looking for people to kill. They discouraged the taking of prisoners. In fact, the only prisoners that were brought back to Denver were 2 little girls and a little boy. There were soldiers killing children on the next day. There's a testimony about one officer who is looking for souvenirs, and he finds a dead woman, and he rolls her over to see if she's got any jewelry or anything on her. And when he rolls her over, he realizes there's a baby. He casually reaches over, picks the baby up by an arm, and pulls out his pistol and shoots the baby in the head and throws the body, and then takes jewelry off the woman.
The attack was so savage, it can still be felt in the presence of modern Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Here's Otto Braided Hair.
But I heard the story from my grandfather, who heard it from my great-grandfather. I heard the story at a real young age, and I don't think I sat all the way through the stories. My grandfather talked about what happened to the children and the woman. I think I just left. I remember walking away. I don't know, I felt like somebody started choking me, and I don't know how long it lasted, but it felt like I couldn't breathe.
Now, Colonel Chivington initially enjoyed the adoration of the local community. They had things in the papers like, Cheyenne scalps are thicker than toads in Egypt. Everybody's got one and is looking for another to send home to their families. Or stringing 100 scalps across the local stage in a theater and pushing these little children out on the stage as exhibits.
Eventually, first-hand accounts from militiamen made their way to the public. Notably, there were 2 letters from Captain Silas Soule to his mother, which expressed his disgust in the massacre. Captain Soule refused to participate in Chivington's supposed battle, but was present as a witness. I was present at a massacre of 300 Indians, mostly women and children. It was a horrible scene, and I would not let my company fire. They were friendly, and some of our soldiers were in the camp at the time trading. It looked too hard for me to see little children on their knees begging for their lives, have their brains beaten like dogs. In a later letter, he wrote, I hope the authorities at Washington will investigate the killings of those Indians. I think they will be apt to hoist some of our high officials.
Eventually, the investigations changed the mood of the country, at least. There were still people in Colorado who defended him, and always would, and some who still do. In general, the majority of people in the country said this goes beyond the pale. You know, even if they bought the stereotype that Indians were different and savages and all of that, they said this is not the way we're supposed to behave. In the Treaty of the Little Arkansas, the government acknowledged its fault in the Sand Creek Massacre. And they also authorized payment to the families that were at Sand Creek. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are lots of times where reparations are paid to tribes, but this is one of the few examples, maybe the only example, they agreed to pay individuals. Chivington crossed the line even for 19th century Americans.
How should you and I, as white Americans, feel about what happened at Sand Creek? Should we inherently feel a sense of guilt?
You know, it's hard to acknowledge that your ancestors could have done something like this. It does us more good to remember these kinds of things as ways of dealing with other controversies. This is not a circumstance that was unique at Sand Creek. There are other episodes that you could use. You can look at My Lai in Vietnam and make some parallels.
The My Lai massacre took place in 1968 during the Vietnam War. Between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians were killed by the U.S. Army in South Vietnam. Typical to atrocities of this nature, punishment was light. Of the 26 soldiers involved, only 1 was charged. Lieutenant William Colley Jr. served 3.5 years house arrest.
I think of it as being something that provides tremendous insight into human nature if we want to peel back the levels. There are circumstances under which ordinary, honest, God-fearing people do terrible, terrible things. Now, some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to rationalize what they had done. The 19th century mindset of white America was pretty much the same whether you justified Sand Creek or whether you condemned Sand Creek. The element that says we are a superior people with a superior claim to the land ran across the different elements of American society. Americans are part of the Western tradition, which is basically sees progress in a linear form. And where you fit on the scale of civilization, for example, depends on certain levels of development. If you have stone tools, you're back here. If you have computers, then you're way up here. So we tend to look at life that way. The people who condemned Sand Creek in 1865 didn't say, okay, let's just leave Colorado. Let's just turn it over to the Indians. Their alternative was, we're going to assimilate them. We're going to bring them into American society. We're going to make them like us. We're going to discourage their languages. We're going to cut their hair. We're going to put them in suits and dresses. We're going to do all of these things, and that way, this is the best solution for dealing with the Indian problem. and we're the good guys. We're going to save the Indian. There's still, if you look at that, you're still looking down. Anytime you're trying to lift people up, you imply that you're above them.
Mark Twain was quoted as saying, "There was nothing so convincing to an Indian as a general massacre. If he could not approve of the massacre, I said the next surest thing for an Indian was soap and education. Soap and education are not as sudden as a massacre, but they are more deadly in the long run, because a half-massacred Indian may recover, but if you educate him and wash him, it is bound to finish him off sometime or another." Gary, what can we learn from the Sand Creek Massacre and atrocities like it?
We need to understand the danger and recognize the role of fear and prejudice in our lives, because fear and prejudice are not only characteristics of the cowardly and the cruel, and we come together frequently and we create a false sense of community in which it becomes them and us. History may repeat itself, but we don't always listen to it.
History does repeat itself. Events like the massacre at Sand Creek sadly appear not only as blemishes in our historical makeup, but as pores, dotting our entire lifespan as beings on this planet. It's not a rare general or warmonger who facilitates barbarity. It's all of those who function under the mindset of superiority. Racial superiority, cultural superiority, superiority dictated by class. Anytime a group is founded upon ideas of separation instead of equality, momentum gathers towards violence. We shouldn't look at history as some old dusty scroll, full of words and instances of what people have done, but as an infallible compass which shows us what people will do. As inquisitors, we should seek nothing but truth and equality. If you enjoyed this episode, please visit and like our Facebook page. You can find us by searching Inquisitor Podcast and looking for our magnifying glass logo. There you will be informed of future episodes, and you may also find links to our website, inquisitorpodcast.com. Thank you for listening to our program today. Join me, Chris Cella, again next month on Inquisitor.